everyone, we're going to look into how to perform blurring in this video. This will be a quick video into learning how to perform blurring. We're going to look into the requirements and what the code would look like. Before we begin, the code will be available on GitHub. I'll put the link in the description. And with that due, let's first look at how our the final project will look like. So I got a text view here and two image views just to get some different colors and stuff. And for us to blur the screen, I can just tap on this floating action button. And this is how it will look. And we can do this for individual views as well. So I have another setup just for this third image view. And this is how it's going to look. Obviously, the blur can be more and can be less, and we can look into that in a second. But if this looks interesting, do keep watching. Alrighty, so before we begin, I should mention that this will use some external libraries to be able to achieve the blur itself. We're gonna go into build a Gradle real quickly. Make sure you have render script target API 19 in here. You will need to use this library to be able to perform the blurring itself. And then we're going to look into how to actually use that library itself as well. So before we go into the good stuff, let's first look into the layout and how generally it is performed. As you saw, I have all my views, all the image views and text views and stuff. But we also have another image view up here. And when we generate the blur view, we're going to need to set it somewhere. If it's an individual view such as this one, which we did on the second case, then you could get the view and then apply the blur into itself. But if you're going to do the whole parent, then you will need a separate image view, which is going to be like match parents or match height, whatever height you want. But this is what it's essentially doing, is that when we create the blur view, we're going to need to set it somewhere. So this will be the layout. In the main activity itself, pretty simple, just a bunch of click listeners. The way we're going to go handle about this is I did put some logs here just to make sure how long it takes. You'll see that sometimes it is different. One of them was the one, like I believe we did the smaller image, and the whole parent probably took a little bit longer. And we will look into how we can actually increase or decrease these further if we want something that's higher quality or lower quality. But this is what we're doing, just setting click listeners, tracking the time, and the blurring happens here. We're going to go look at that in a second. And just some visibility stuff so that if I click on something, I'm removing all this stuff and then making sure that only the blur view is visible. And that's about it. So to actually go about doing the blurring, we're going to look into the fab first, which is the one where I click here and the whole view gets blurred out. Is that we set the image view or the bitmap that we get from our helper method, which is right here. I'm going to close these out. And at the end of it, we will receive a bitmap. And this is going to be the bitmap, which is the blurred one. And then obviously it will just be set on the image view. So to go about doing that, the first thing that we do is get sort of like a screenshot from the current view. So if we go back in here, you'll notice that I'm passing the ID of my parent activity parent layout, and this is the entire view of our screen. So essentially what I'm telling the helper method here is I want to blur the entire activity. And in the second case that we saw is I'm simply passing the ID of the image view, which should be this one. I clicked on the wrong one. This one right here. So it's pretty dynamic in that case. You could make blur essentially any view on the screen. When we do get the view, the first thing we're going to do is convert it to a bitmap so we can modify it, scale it down, blur it obviously. So there's another quick helper method where we'll use the canvas and draw methods from the view class to simply just generate a view or a bitmap from our view that was passed in up here. So this will be the original bitmap. This will be what the part of the screen that will be blurred. An important part of the blurring is that we can actually scale down the view or the bitmap before we actually start blurring it. By default, I've set it to 4, but this could be either scaled up or down. And let's quickly go ahead and what I mean by this. So the way that it works is that we are creating a resized bitmap from the original one. Right now I set it as 1, which means that keep the width and the height of the original bitmap. We will be dividing it in this case of 1. So scale down factor that I compiled at this moment is 1, which means that it will not be scaled down. So if we go ahead and blur it, you'll notice that it's still kind of like higher quality and not as blur, but it's taking 253 milliseconds. And the reason for that is because, well, our bitmap that we're working on is 4 times as larger, right? If we're going to scale it down to be lower, then it will be a much smaller size. And since we're blurring it, you won't actually feel much of a difference in terms of like the blur quality. Like this is a good blur. So it really just depends on how much blur you're gonna need. So you could play with that variable. The third part is the out bitmap. So we are going to be producing a lot of these, but essentially another one that we need is the final bitmap essentially. And the final bitmap that will have the blur of itself will simply take the size of the resized bitmap. So whatever size this was, we're going to use the same width and height, and it will be created from the resized. So right now we're just getting set up. We created a smaller version if we needed to, and we created a final bitmap to have our final blur screen. And then we're going to start using the render script library, which I don't know how to pronounce this correctly. I believe it's Intrinsic Blur Script. So you will need this library. Just make sure it is inside your build.gradle. And we're gonna go ahead and just set it up, create the type of the blur, and some allocations and stuff that we're gonna set up. So creation for all in, as in what is our input source essentially, and all out would be essentially what is our output source. Once we set up input and output, another variable that we could do is the radius of the blur. If you've used blurs before, this is a one way where you could make an image or a view be more blurry or not as much blurry, and the range is 1 till 25. So by default I've set it to 25, but obviously let's go ahead and try it with like only one. Oh, it's not a float. There we go. And if we hit it, you notice that it wasn't as blurry as the last one because one is obviously not that high. And I do wonder how much the duration was. A little bit smaller, probably less to work with. And then we're gonna go ahead and set the inputs and apply the output for it. And this is where the blurring actually happens. And then we copy the which one is this? All out, right? So we're gonna copy the all out allocation and stuff which we had here, and copy it to an actual bitmap. We do need to do that because all out is not a bitmap; it's of type allocation. So we can't just directly return this. We do need to convert it sort of like to a bitmap. And just final cleaning stuff up. We created a bunch of bitmaps. Just make sure you recycle those and destroy the render script back here. And at the end of it, you have the bitmap, which you can return back to your activity. That sums it up. Most of the blurring, as I mentioned, is done by the render script itself, but the helper method is in a good position to kind of be modified and changed at will. So let's go ahead and play around with a couple of these. So one thing I wanted to quickly mention is, for example, we could have a blur of 1 for the radius. And let's go ahead and increase like the scale down factor to maybe as high as 16, which means that the image that we take would be fairly small, 1/16 of what it is, and it would be scaled down. So the blurring would happen a lot quicker, and it won't necessarily lose. Well, it is a little bit pixelated, I guess now. 16 was a little bit too much. But remember, this was a radius of 1, so that's like essentially nothing. I found 4 to be a good position so that the image is not pixelated. So this one might be a little bit pixelated as well. And if you like set this back to 25, it'll be a lot blurrier. But essentially what I'm trying to get at is that both of these variables can affect the blurriness by essentially a lot. The image being scaled down and then blurred out could have different effects. So it'll mostly be about playing around and see what is right for your application. And let's do it one more time because it's kind of fun to look at. Yeah. I've seen the duration to take somewhere about 250 if the scale down effect, as we saw at the beginning, to be just 1. And you could reduce it to less than 30 milliseconds if you like to. So should be essentially a quick and instant way to blur out your entire screen or just a section of your screen for your app. And that should be the end of the tutorial. If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe.